Welcome. This is my call. Oh, wait.
It always does that. I'm going to turn mine off.
I know. Just let me just. Okay, I need to. Okay.
Feel free to.
Welcome and thank you so much for agreeing to do this. This is Michael Langoy, and I will like to start by asking you, what are some of your social identities that you go by?
Oh boy, so that's a good one. So I guess I would say that I am a cisgender man, white, bisexual, in a same-sex marriage. And I grew up in a middle-class background by profession. And I think it would have been more of a lower middle-class background by economic standards. So those are some of my social identities. Oh, I'm also a geek in terms of gaming and video gaming and game culture.
Great, thank you. So Mike, one of the things I have been asking around for clinicians is really to talk about their experience with working with systems of oppression in their work. What narratives stand out for you around systems of oppression in your work?
So, I actually gave this a little thought as we were, because I knew we were going to be talking today. And one of the things there are certain things that stand out in my mind. And one is a book title, not even necessarily the book, but the book title that I see in my mind's eye. And it was in graduate school. It was called The Hidden Injuries of Class. And I guess what I thought was interesting about that concept was when I started to reflect on class, I started to see that I actually grew up with very different, in some ways, values about or understandings about money. And I think that discourse is going to kind of be important as we talk more about, socially just practice. And specifically what occurred to me was my father was a teacher and in a union and a public official in terms of that. And so growing up, everyone knew how much money everyone made because people either were making minimum wage and you knew what that was, or people were in a union position and you knew what that was. And it wasn't until I was probably in a relationship at a party, and I was many years later, and I was talking about jobs and talking about how excited I was with my job and what the unit contract gave me, and wondering about other people's incomes, and my boyfriend at the time actually said, "You can't talk like that." And I was like, "Why?" He's like, "Well, we don't talk about how much money we make." And I didn't understand why that was. And I've come to find out that it's a real social inhibition, part of which I firmly believe is put in place by people at the higher end of the financial spectrum because they want to have less competition and negotiation with salaries. But coming from my background, where people either made minimum wage or were unionized as a profession, the idea that these things were secret or shouldn't be talked about was really strange. And so I think that narrative is probably one that I took with me into my social work graduate program.
Mm-hmm. So how do you engage what you now hear a lot about critical anti-racism work or racial justice framework in your practice?
Okay, so I was sort of setting us up for that with how I answered the last question, because I think the most important thing for me as someone that is, my job currently is in private practice, and I'm also a consultant. So I consult with people, which means I'm really a solo practitioner. I'm not subsidized by any agencies. I don't have any sort of wherewithal and other than what I bring in. And so my first sort of kind of suggestion to people is to really get honest with themselves and get real with themselves about the fact that we live in a capitalist system and that we need to earn money if we're going to survive in this capitalist system, and that there's nothing inherently wrong with that. And if you really think there is something wrong with that, then you either need to try to change capitalism or go to another country which has a different system. But once you accept that, it makes it a lot easier for you to start to delineate between the work I want to do for social justice, the work I need to do to earn my keep, and where there is overlap. And so for me, one of the best examples is, as a private practitioner, I don't take insurance being in network. Because when I'm in network, I have to sign a contract with somebody else, and there's all sorts of rules that not only are discouraging in terms of privacy, but are discouraging in terms of pay. And I'm the primary breadwinner in my family, so I really do need to make a living by today's standards in the United States and Massachusetts. And what I need to do, therefore, is kind of look at that and say, okay, that's what I need to make, but I still want to do socially just practice. And what about all those people that rely on their health insurance because they feel like they should be able to get health care? And I actually think people should get health care too. So how do I resolve that conflict? And it's a conflict I think a lot of clinicians avoid thinking about. We talk about how we're for universal health care, but we're not necessarily wanting the salary that would come if universal health care really kind of negotiated rates down. And the rates for universal health care might be really different than what we imagine we need. So that conflict for me is one that made me feel really uncomfortable for a while, until I realized that I didn't have to go within the framework of insurance in order to do social justice work. And so what I do is I have a certain number of my cases. So let's say if I'm seeing 20 cases in a week, 4 cases of those are what I would call pro bono plus 10, which is that a person never has to pay more than $10 a session for me, with the exception of if they are chronically canceling or having a hard time showing up. And so for me, that is an example of a very simple social justice piece where I don't have to engage in sort of the bureaucracy and the difficulties of insurance, but I get to actually offer low cost psychotherapy to people. And we used to do this a lot more. We used to have folks doing it as parts of internships and early trainings, but any clinician can do this. It's really important to know that you can look at your caseload and you can decide what percentage of your weekly work you want to do at a pro bono plus 10 or pro bono plus 5 or just pro bono. So that's one way that I actually do that.
Thank you. Now, I would imagine, or actually, let me just ask, how do you address issues of racial trauma in your work? And particularly, how do you develop ways of listening to, thinking about, and working with racial trauma narratives with your clients?
So that's a really important piece of our work. And I really think, first off, one needs to have the idea that one's a lifelong learner in terms of race and racism. I have been involved in diversity trainings and sociocultural concept and anti-racism classes pretty much since I was able to teach as a graduate and undergraduate professor. So that's one piece. And then there's Judy Herman's trauma theory model, which I think is crucial and I think can really blend very, very nicely with that. But in terms of moving away from the theoretical to the clinical, I think the most important thing I have found is that if I want to work with folks across racial lines, and I really do, I have a pretty diverse practice and I enjoy that. In order to do that, there are a couple things that I need to do. First off, in terms of referrals, so that people know I'm out there and know that I want to do this work and that I've been trained to do it, I need to kind of put myself out there. I need to list that and not only my interest, but also my experience, some of my training, my background. So people know that I actually have some sense of what I'm doing. Because I think being a do-gooder is a part of it, but I don't think it's enough. I think one needs to know you've got some training. Um, in terms of when someone shows up in my door, if a person comes into my office or into my Zoom and they are either Black or Asian or Latino or any race or ethnicity that is different than white, that is visible, I find that it's really important in that intake to mention it. And I mention it, in a way that it uses a little bit of lighterness and humor. I say, you may have noticed that you're Black and I'm white, and that in fact that's going to be the case in if you have treatment with me. And so, what would it be like for you to have a white therapist? And a lot of times the first answer I get is, well, no, it wouldn't be a problem. It would be fine. And I'd say, and so then I might need to say, well, I asked the question because we do live in a society we have systemic racism, that it's everywhere. And that there are times that I may actually fail to understand you, partially along racial lines or partially because of my privilege. And I want you to know that I hold that sense of idea in terms of of work. So I really think it's important that we won't make it a focal point of the treatment if you don't think it is useful to do so. And I know that's not why you came in here, but I don't want to just give me a pass in here because I'm imagining you may have met white people in your life that were not understanding of you. And I don't want to be another one of those. So naming that right at the beginning, and balancing naming it with, if they say, okay, well, it's good you told me that, I'm really okay. Okay, well, then we put it away for a while, right? I don't want to make it be about my belief or my projection, because that may not be something that they were thinking a lot about. But it needs to be named in the first session, because if it's not named in the first session, then I feel like I've been entering into a therapeutic contract in bad faith. And I think that part of what I think of in terms of psychotherapy is I'm influenced heavily by ego psychology. And I believe the ego function of reality testing is really important. And so I believe naming racism and naming race in therapy is part of my providing ego functioning and ego support for the patient and the treatment.
Thank you. You've anticipated a couple of questions there for me. But when you think about your work, what has worked or not worked? What have you found therapeutic, anti-therapeutic, I would even say non-therapeutic? Take it away from there.
Oh gosh, what has worked? Well, I gave you an example of that, and then I think that works. I think what doesn't work, and that's a learning process. So I guess let me tell you my biggest one of my biggest empathic failures when I was working with adolescents in an inner city district, and it was a young woman who was Caribbean Latina who had that I'd been working with for probably at this point 5 to 6 years. And from right at the beginning of middle school, she was midway through high school and she was thinking of dropping out. And I was trying to explain to her about how much bigger the world was than the city that she lived in. And I said, when you get your education, you could travel anywhere in the world. If you wanted to go anywhere in the world, where would you go? And I was thinking, Paris, England, Ireland, Asia, somewhere in my head, like things that I imagined I wanted to go. And she looked at me, she said, Lawrence, Massachusetts. And that moment, I realized that was my empathic failure, because that made sense. Lawrence, Mass was far enough away from her parents and her life that it felt distant, but it was still a community that she could recognize, that she could feel comfortable in, that she felt part of. and that not everyone feels safe to travel, either in the United States or in the world, because of their ethnicity or their race. You know, we had sundown towns where you better not be there. You know, in this last century, right at the beginning of this century. So you know, that was a really good example of what I would call an empathic failure, and what Kola would call an empathic failure. And the trick is not to be mortified about these, to acknowledge them, and often acknowledge them with the patient. But I think the other example of this was when I really made the mistake of imagining that a young Asian woman I was working with knew me well enough to know that when I was speaking in a trope about Asian Americans, that I didn't believe that trope, that naming that racist identity would be able to be held in our conversation. And in fact, it wasn't. In fact, the fact that I spoke that and that she became aware that I knew of that trope and I could name it, it contaminated the treatment rather than what I had imagined. I would have imagined, I was in my head imagining with perhaps some grandiosity, oh, well, we're connected enough. She knows me well enough to know I don't hold those values, without giving a thought to the fact that therapy as a space needs to be protected and held, and to even introduce that concept from somebody else or from the world's dominant misperceptions is still an intrusion. And so I would have tread a lot more carefully. I would have not brought it up that way, and I probably wouldn't have brought it up at all.
So some of the examples you've given, or most of the examples you've given there, have been mostly BIPOC. What about with white clients? How have you brought up issues of race or racism?
So that's a blind spot in some ways for me, and it's, you know, it's interesting because we're talking about in some ways white fragility, and white people have even now have the privilege of being in denial of the fact that their whiteness is an issue, and so I won't do the same thing that I just said I would do if a client who identified or presented as a person of BIPOC would come in. What I wouldn't bring up, well, you may have noticed you are white and I'm white in here. What happens with those folks is I will challenge things when they come up. And so, for example, I had a conversation the other day with a white male patient of mine who actually is in a parenting relationship and a marriage with multiracial children. And there was a conversation about, trying to remember exactly what it was, but there was a sense that he had that it was too early to talk with his kids about race, that school had it. And there was also a sense that, he had an understanding that of race, that perhaps he was missing a few things. And so I was challenging him about that, and challenging him partly by identifying. And I think we both grew up in a certain part of the country, and we both share certain histories of what we've heard and what we've seen. And so my work with white patients when those things come up is to say, this is what what I've may have encountered, and this is what I'm seeing. And you may want to think about this in terms of your parenting. You may want to think about this in terms of your kids. But I kind of go first in terms of, I identify and say, I know some of the things that I experienced growing up were, there was a rock in our town where the local adolescents partied that was called Hitler's Rock because it had a swastika on it. It never occurred to me that, the egregiousness and the horror of that because my town didn't have a lot of folks that were Jewish. And so I can call on some of those stories and sort of examples of things that I didn't know. So in some ways, doing this sort of work with white patients, for me, requires a little more just sometimes disclosure, a little more working in the intersubjective field, because I think it's really important. You can be annoyed with white fragility, you can see it, you can call it out, but in therapy, if you just do those things, it's not going to help the patient, and it's not going to keep them in a relationship with you where change can happen. So I really have to sort of go first and talk about my white fragility, my white privilege, and then say, do you think maybe this is similar to what you're going through?
Right, thank you. So now, in conclusion, is there a question you wish I had asked? I know that this is a very brief conversation that you wish I had asked.
You know, I kind of came prepared with a couple of tips, and the first tip I've already mentioned, which is really get real with yourself in terms of money and the fact that you live in a capitalist system, and that you know you need to tease out what you can afford, and then separate that from how you want to do your social justice stuff. I do a free nonprofit. I did a nonprofit startup called Case for Here, where we do free expert witness testimony for folks that are either seeking asylum or in danger of deportation. And that is completely free, and the clinicians and I that do it, it's completely free. So that is something that we all do as extra. Nobody gets anything in terms of reimbursement for that. So I think that's the first thing. The second one, I would say, for white clinicians especially, and for cis norm, heteronorm clinicians especially, what I would say is, you know, try when you're responding to somebody who's expressing some form of oppression or marginalization, try to focus on the areas in which you are dominant rather than the areas in which you're targeted. And I think of it in terms of similar to grief, that, you know, when so often when one of us has had a loss and we're grieving, and other people attempt to comfort us, the first thing they do is to say, you know, when my mother died, or when my pet died, or when my child died. And really they make it all about them. They pull the focus off of the grieving person, not because they want to, but because they're trying to identify or find common ground, probably. And we do that with oppression too. And so if someone comes in and is focusing on having been harassed by virtue of their race, I need to not go to having been, you know, a gay identified bisexual man first, and say, you know, I know what it's like to be oppressed because I've had people hate on me for this or that. I need to go first to where I've been dominant, and really kind of hold that first. Because it's really important not to pull focus away from who is having the injury and who is doing the work around healing in that moment. And it's and my view is it's the patient first. If I get healing out of it too, which I often do, that's great, but that's secondary. That's not why we do this work.
Wow, thank you very much, Mike. Our time is up, and I really appreciate your spending this time with me. So thank you so much. And this brings us to the close of our interview.
Thank you for having me.